So each of these CEOs are spearheading an effort in different aspects of neurodegenerative diseases, whether it be epilepsy, migraine, Alzheimer's disease, dementias of all sorts that affect the brain and the central nervous system. And so they have so much to offer to open our eyes as to where we're going. Now, just by way of backdrop, there has not been a single therapy for Alzheimer's disease approved since 2003. And the only approved therapies for Alzheimer's is symptomatic relief, not disease modifying. Some companies, such as Pfizer, they've completely bowed out of trying to develop any further drugs in this space. So it looks bleak, right? Well, I think today the panel of experts that we've assembled will shed light on the fact that it's darkest before dawn, and we're at the cusp of probably an exciting new period where these therapies come to the fore. Biotech has the unique skills and tools available to us to actually solve this problem, which has eluded us to this point. So there are roughly 5 million North Americans that are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, about 1 million with Parkinson's disease, about 3 million with epilepsy, about 400,000 with multiple sclerosis. So we're looking at a crisis in these areas. So in other areas of biotech, we've seen enormous breakthroughs. In cancer, we've seen immuno-oncology that basically takes cancer without the need of chemotherapy and bring it into remission. In HIV, we've seen breakthroughs from going through the past 20 years, from Biochem Pharma, a Canadian company, right through to Gilead with Truvada and PrEP, that basically has arrested the spread of HIV. We've seen Gilead buy Pharmacet, 6-7 years ago, to develop Sovaldi, which cures hepatitis C. So we've seen enormous breakthroughs for things that were inconceivable before. Today, we've assembled a panel that will talk about neurodegenerative diseases. So our three panelists includes Dr. Sina Habibi, who's coming from London, England, for this panel and the panel that follows. So thank you very much, Sina. I appreciate it very much. He is the CEO of a company that's developing this extraordinary diagnostic tool to read the brain signals for potential changes in neuronal growth in the brain, and as precursors, as an early diagnostic for any form of dementia. Right now it's being applied to Alzheimer's. It can be applied to a wide range of neurodegenerative diseases. We have Doug Jansen, who I've known for about 20 years. He was a first star analyst at Cormark, Sprott Securities 20 years ago, became the CFO of Cardiome, started his own business. He's now the CEO of Aequus Pharmaceutical, who is in the process of filing a registration trial for Trokendi XR, which is a blockbuster US FDA-approved drug for epilepsy and migraine. So we're delighted to have Doug here. Doug has flown in from Vancouver for this panel. And we have Dr. Elliot Goldstein, who was once CEO of British Biotech, headed up the R&D division of a US biotech company, Maxigen, and is now the CEO of one of the most promising Canadian investments, ProMIS Neurosciences, who is developing a therapy, a monoclonal antibody, to address the core root of Alzheimer's disease. It's one of the most exciting stories out there that few people even know about, but we're privileged. We've been investors for over 3 years, almost 4 years. Our initial investment was around 3 cents. The stock is now tenfold. We think it goes much, much higher than that over the long period of time. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to have each of you spend a couple of minutes describing your company, describing what your focus is, where do you think you're going, what your core technology is. Sina?
Thanks, Eden. And thanks for your time. So we are a spin-out from Cambridge University. As you mentioned, we have used artificial intelligence and latest neuroscience to come up with this revolutionary test, which can detect very early stage, preclinical stages of the disease. The physiopathology of the disease goes 25 years before the onset of symptoms we know today, such as memory loss. And the problem at the moment is that we wait till till our patient cannot find their address back home until we could intervene. Our aim is to take that time a lot earlier. Before we lose much of the brain, we want to act earlier when we have more chances of success.
Great. The other aspect about Sina's company is they're really a hybrid of focusing on neurodegenerative diseases, but they also use artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's why Sina is actually going to be on our second panel as well. So what they've done is they are able, through a really innovative, visually oriented and speed-oriented technology, able to map how healthy your brain is based on your ability for signals to go from your visual cortex to your neocortex to your hippocampus into motion. And so it's actually quite extraordinary. And what this means is, the implication for this is that this could potentially become a surrogate endpoint in Alzheimer's trials. So one of the really difficult aspects of Alzheimer's is it's almost medieval in how subjective the process is to this point, which is why the failure rate's been so high. So to have new tools like what Sina is developing will actually provide a quantitative tool by which you can measure neurodegeneration in the brain. Doug?
Thanks, Eden. We bring drugs that are available in Europe or the US into Canada and bridge them through whatever Health Canada studies are required. And then with our sales force, we sell those in Canada. And that puts us directly in contact with specialists in the ophthalmology space and in the neurology space. In neurology, we have active programs for epilepsy, antipsychotics. And I think one of the things Eden was saying before, this applies to pharmaceuticals in general. Like we're pretty good at treating symptoms. We're rarely good at actually treating the underlying disease. And when you think about neurological conditions, that applies one level further. I think we still don't know what the specific mechanism of the disease is for things like Alzheimer's. There's lots of different theories. You think about concussion disorder. It's a black box by and large, how we treat that. And I think the opportunity to take products forward, there's such a huge unmet need. And as you start developing assets that make a lot of sense, just as a Canadian, and I assume most of you are, most of those products, half of the products available in the US never make it into Canada. There's not a commercial rationale to bring them here, or there's a regulatory burden that goes beyond what is there for FDA. And it's that bridging that need and that gap is what Aequus does. So our revenues, we reported our 5th straight quarter of revenue growth for Q3. I can tell you Q4 will be our 6th straight growth, and we keep adding additional products to Canada to benefit patients and benefit Canadian clinicians.
Thank you. As Doug mentioned, it was a real coup that they were able to snag the Canadian rights to a drug called Trokendi XR. Generic version exists in the United States and in Canada. In Canada, it does about 28 million, which is a big drug in Canada. But he was able to secure the Canadian rights to the blockbuster Trokendi XR, which is once daily for epilepsy and migraines. And he just has to run a 60-patient registration trial. It'll be on the market in 2020. Probably sales in the order of 5 million the first year, 10 million the second year, 15 million the third year. So this is independent of the other sources of revenue that exist in the company. And it's a credit to Doug's deal making that he was able to secure the rights. I know of another much bigger company that really covets the rights to that drug. So credit to Doug for actually having secured that. Elliot?
Yeah, hi, I'm Elliot Goldstein, CEO of ProMIS Neurosciences. We're a late preclinical development stage company focused exclusively on chronic neurodegenerative diseases. That's the world's largest unmet market. There, as Eden was saying, for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, ALS, those are our three main foci. There's no root cause therapy today, but only symptomatic therapies, many of which outside of Parkinson's disease have only very short-term effects. So the unmet need is massive. We estimate about $500 billion. The Alzheimer's Association of the United States estimated that the direct and indirect costs of addressing Alzheimer's disease with poor, ineffective treatments was $500 billion, with a B, billion dollars in 2013. Expected to triple to $1.5 trillion in the next decade to two because of the baby boomer boom. So that's really the, sort of the market and the socioeconomic interest of addressing that. We're based in, we have a headquarters in Toronto. Our discovery research is under worldwide exclusive license from the University of British Columbia. We have over 45 patents issued worldwide. We launched the company in 2015, on Canada Day, actually. Interestingly, it's important to note that our proprietary technology allows us to address what is widely believed to be the root cause of the underlying driver, if you like, of these progressive neurodegenerative disease. And these are toxic misfolded proteins that slowly propagate through the brain, destroying brain cells. And we've been able to identify and create and validate antibodies that are highly selective only for these toxic forms of the proteins, because of course you don't want to knock out normal forms, either because it's just a waste of ammunition, or more importantly, normal forms of many of these proteins have important physiological functions. We're listed on the TSX and the main board, OTCQB. In addition to discovery research at the University of British Columbia, our main development site is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm located in San Francisco, the other sort of biopole or biotech pole of North America.
Thank you, Elliot. So one of the interesting things about ProMIS is when I first invested in them about 3.5 years ago, Elliot and Jean, who was an SVP at Janzen, biotech giant Janzen in Boston, what they understood was they had a profound understanding of what perhaps the mechanism of action is that leads to Alzheimer's disease. At the time, the conventional understanding of Alzheimer's was plaques in the brain is the cause of Alzheimer's. What these gentlemen understood was it's actually the precursor misfolded toxic oligonucleotides of a certain molecular weight. So they then proceeded, with the help of scientists and a physics officer, to identify what the markers were of these oligomers. They're called epitopes. They were then able to develop antibodies that would bind to these specific epitopes. And their first humanized antibody, PMN 310, is going to go into clinic this year. Now, by way of reference, back in March of 2015, biotech giant Biogen was in phase 1 of its number one, probably the most valuable drug franchise in the clinic right now, aducanumab. It's now in phase 3. That drug is going to read out in 2020, and it'll probably get approved, but it has dose-limiting toxicities associated with it. So only a certain dose will be likely approved for it, but it will get approved and will become a billion-dollar drug. What Elliot and his team were able to figure out was that if you can identify the correct toxic oligomers of the correct Ig type, then you're able to avoid the dose-limiting toxicities and bind more specifically to what the culprit behind the cause of Alzheimer's is. And it's actually quite a remarkable achievement that took a long time for the industry to recognize. Now, to Elliot and Jean's credit, they were able to snag some key leaders in the field. So Anthony Giovanessi, for instance, his company Synapsys was developing a drug for Parkinson's disease, which was a better release version of levodopa, because in Parkinson's, you do not produce enough dopamine. And so his company, Synapsys, developed that, and a Japanese company paid 120% premium. Fortunately, we own that company, paid 120% premium to buy it out. Anthony Giovanessi is now on the board of directors of ProMIS. Rudy Tanzi is one of the top key opinion leaders in Alzheimer's in the world. He is now one of the members of the scientific board for ProMIS. So I think that's a tremendous amount of validation for the approach that ProMIS is going down. And again, it's under $100 million market cap. We think it'll be worth more. When Biogen reported phase 1 data on its phase 1 program in aducanumab in 2015, it added $20 billion of market cap that day. So there's some mispricing in the marketplace right now for these companies. Okay, first question is, the FDA has recognized a crisis in neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and they have changed the rules to develop drugs for Alzheimer's. That benefits any company that is developing a therapy for any sort of neurodegenerative disease. So I invite each of our panelists to maybe comment on what the implications are of this FDA reform as far as neurodegenerative diseases, how it impacts them in terms of cost of capital, and in terms of the number of trials that has to be run, and the speed to market.
Very interesting question. So while FDA is out there to make sure the products that companies put on the market don't have any risk to their users, they also have another function, and they look out for what is good, what is needed for the market. When we had our pre-submission application to the FDA, they came back to us and said, oh, this is very interesting. Can you add more to your claims? Because we need this. There hasn't been much innovation in this space. As you mentioned, 2003, memantine was the last drug receiving FDA approval. Since then, 650 trials have failed. And it shows you the scale of the problem we're facing. It costs you around $5 billion to develop an Alzheimer's disease drug. So they reached out and asked for more. This is because they know there is a problem, and they have the functions in place to facilitate innovation in this space. And we're very grateful to it, because we're well positioned to be in parts, to be not only in helping the care, but also developing drug trials. As you mentioned, we can help with recruitment. We have a widely accessible monitoring tool that we can find the candidates. One of the biggest problems you have with drug trials is finding the right candidate to go on trials. One other problem that you have is that you cannot measure with the existing technology if your drugs are working. And there's no correlation with the biomarkers, yes. Which leaves you completely hopeless. So we're hoping that soon we can have a huge role in drug discovery, development, as well as helping the healthcare.
Yeah. Sina's company, Cognetivity, will be filing a new drug device, a 505B filing later this year. They will get FDA approval, and that will aid with early diagnosis of dementias, including Alzheimer's. Doug?
I think it's, we've seen the success, other regulatory kind of pathways like orphan drug status. I think in the cardiovascular world, breakthrough therapy status, it's sped up drug development. Anytime you can speed that up, you can come to a clinical hypothesis quicker and cheaper. So there's no question, this new pathway with FDA is going to benefit developers in the space. It's still, you think about Alzheimer's, it's still a $5 billion ticket, to run a clinical program, and there's only a handful of companies on the planet who can do that. So I think it's a net positive for developers in the space. In the Canadian context, it's probably not an issue because Health Canada has its own set of regulations and usually doesn't think this way. Yeah. So I think I applaud what the FDA is doing, because it's, like to have one of the biggest societal impacts of any disease, and to have only a single successful product in the last 20 years is really, it's a shame. Yeah. it's not working.
Yeah, just to build on that, just a couple of quick comments. Why biomarkers? We're working on a biomarker initiative that we're actually starting in Toronto and then spreading across Canada and the US, looking at blood biomarkers that are represented in the blood, so very easy to detect and diagnose. The lead on that is something called neurofilament light chain, when neurons die, which is actually the root cause of all these neurodegenerative diseases, just death of brain cells, neurons, when they split open the axon, which is the main body of the cell, it just spills out neurofilament light chain. And this is reflected in the bloodstream. So what's interesting about biomarkers is the ability to predict well in advance of clinical signs and symptoms, one, patient progress, if you like, but more importantly, their response in clinical trials. Why is that important? Well, we build leaky boats. That's the business we're in. Think about it. What is it? 1 in 10 drugs across the board actually come out of phase 1 and get to approval. Approximately. It's a lot less in neurodegen, obviously. So of the 10 boats we build, you've really got 2 ways to figure out which one is valid. And I'm giving you a really simple analogy. One, load them all up with people and goods, send them across the Atlantic, and watch them all sink, except for maybe one that makes it. That costs billions of dollars and takes a lot of time. The other way is to find the leaky boats in their design or when you're first building them, or fix it, but do that early on. Do that preclinically in the case of drugs. The other great advantage, right now, as colleagues were saying, it's hundreds of millions of dollars in the clinic to get to the end of the phase 3 or even more. Just take any number you want, it's massive. And if you fail at that stage, it gives really cold feet to try it again with a backup or different product. Now let's take another example where you could make the go, no-go decision, because most of the time the decision you're going to make in pharmaceutical drug development is no-go. Most of the boats are leaky, so find it early on. If you can make that decision that the product you're developing isn't worth developing, if you make that decision at the end of phase 1 for, say, $15 or $20 million of clinical expenditure, now what you can do is you can take 2 or 3 or 4 variants of your product, its lead, the backup, take them into the clinic at the same time. It's called cassette dosing, and then choose the one that looks the best. Don't choose the leaky boats. So the impact, the socioeconomic impact is massive. In terms of Canada and Canadian regulations, I'm hopeful that they're going to change very rapidly. EMA is also looking at this, the European regulatory authorities, and the socioeconomic impact of slowing or stopping cognitive decline is so massive that there's such a strong economic driver to do this. I can't see any responsible modern government, maybe outside of the US because it's irresponsible, but quite frankly, any responsible Western government not going down this route of early decision making in biomarkers and clinical trials.
Yeah, I think it's like when you think about the cancer space, we have exquisitely accurate biomarkers in cancer, and it's one of the reasons why the progress in therapies has been so broad in the last 10 years. I think another big game-changing thing affecting neurology is going to be, we're getting a lot better at our imaging technology. From what we can do with images, the availability of images, our ability to intervene in surgical cases, all that kind of engineering side of neurology is advancing rapidly, and I think it's going to benefit drug developers like Elliot and others.
Great. Alzheimer's often incubates and develops over a decade or 2 before it's actually diagnosed. And some of it may be due to genetic reasons, some may be due to epigenetic reasons, but there is a pressing need for some sort of companion diagnostic, some sort of technology that is able to detect and determine that there is some sort of causal relationship between these things. Perhaps you can talk about some of those features, some of those aspects that's built into your technology to be able to detect these things.
Absolutely. As Elliot mentioned, we are actually improving with our biomarkers, even the neuroimaging ones, and bringing these earlier. I often say where we are with Alzheimer's is where we were with cancer 20 years ago. Biomarkers are getting better and more precise. That helps us developing therapeutics that can address those. And we're very well placed with our technology to actually make sense of those biomarkers in actual cognitive performance of the patients. And the change is coming, and I'm quite positive.
Yeah, I think one of the really exciting developments here is one of the real problems, and particularly with Alzheimer's disease, is that original models were based on the wrong hypothesis. They were plaque-based models because plaque was thought to be the bad actor, if you like, and plaque is neutral and may even have a beneficial function. But animal models were developed with translocating human genes, so they created a lot of plaque in the animals, developed drugs to remove the plaque, and guess what? They didn't work, billions of dollars later. So a couple of comments here. So one is, if you understand the underlying mechanism, then you can create a model that's closer to the disease. It'll never be the disease, but at least closer to it. Secondly, if you can have this early decision making with biomarkers, you'll make your decision based on response in the clinic early on, as long as the drug is reasonably safe, which is fairly easy to do, in particular for antibodies. You make your decision early on, not based on a model that may or may not be effective, that may or not be appropriate. As the science changes, many of those models are just disregarded and thrown, let's base it on human data. So I think that's a huge advantage coming forward, because again, if we do not slow or stop the progression of all of these neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's in particular, but there's over 10 million patients with Parkinson's disease. There's rare disease which are devastating, like Lewy body dementia and frontotemporal dementia. There's chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or football disease, if you like, from repetitive head trauma, which is a major, major issue in young children. It's affecting lives in school. You can just look at the impact. So addressing these diseases and the root cause is really important. The last point I'd like to make is, in my experience, having worked in autoimmune disorders and chronic diseases, I've worked in transplant, worked on the first transplant drug at Sandoz. Anyway, these serious chronic diseases really almost always require a cocktail of therapy to address them. Obviously something that addresses the root cause to stop the neurodegeneration. That's what we're working on. But ancillary therapies are just as important. What do you do about the psychiatric disturbances that these diseases have? Normal psychotropic drugs are dangerous in patients with Alzheimer's. Maybe cannabinoids could be useful, I don't know, but these are avenues that are being explored. The brain slowly adapts over 10, 15 years before any symptoms occur, but the adaptation, the physiological adaptation that gives the brain its plasticity often involves inflammation, which contributes to the problem. So an ideal cocktail would be something that address the underlying killing of the neurons, root cause therapy. These are toxic oligomers that propagate, like prions. Then psychiatric symptoms with anxiety, mild depression, etc. What do you choose that? Drugs to treat the neuroinflammation. And the current drugs that are on the market today, they're very good. They're neurotransmission inhibitors, but if you think of your neurons like little bridges in your brain, they're collapsing, they're dying. Neurotransmission enhancers push more traffic across the bridge, chemical and electrical traffic. But at some point, the bridge is collapsing. There's no point. There's nothing to get across. You're going straight into the canyon, right? But if you combined all those therapies, stop the dying of neurons, arrest the neuroinflammation, treat the psychiatric disturbances, and now you've got a holistic, it takes a village approach to address these diseases, and that's what we all have to do together.
I think one of the really interesting opportunities that's emerging in investing in neurodegenerative disease companies that are finding solutions is, we can take an example of a company like Sarepta Therapeutics, which has been a tremendous winner for us in our fund, is they were developing a drug for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And it was a really contentious panel meeting. It was an extraordinary event. And the panel voted down the approval of Sarepta's drug. Janet Woodcock, head of the FDA, superseded that, and they ended up approving the drug. And it was based solely on biomarkers, changes in biomarkers. That company now does $300 million in revenues, has a market cap close to $10 billion. And so we think that that's exactly the opportunity that we're seeing investing in companies with attacking neurological disorders, because they're finding solutions that doesn't quite exist. Like I mentioned, Biogen is developing a monoclonal antibody for Alzheimer's. It's probably the most valuable pre-revenue program out there in biotech. It's probably worth around $10 billion, Elliot. And again, you look at a company like ProMIS that, one of the interesting things about ProMIS and Elliot and Jean is that they confidently predicted the failure of certain Alzheimer's trials along the way. And I would sit there and they would talk about it and they'd explain in advance why these trials would fail, because they had such a grasp and understanding of what the mechanism of action was behind the cause of Alzheimer's. And so having watched this over a certain period of time, it gives you a certain confidence that they actually do understand what the mechanism of action is behind such a disease. And so I think that gives us hope looking out. And to that point, maybe Sina, Doug, Elliot, maybe you can shed some light on what the mechanism of action, what the causes are of some of these neurological diseases. I know Elliot, for instance, focuses SOD1, TDP-43, in ALS and Alzheimer's, and then, Sina, I know that you're able to pick up signals of any form of dementia in different forms. So maybe you can add some insight into what the causes are of these diseases.
Well, as we understand it, the field has progressed over the last 20 years. So despite all the disappointments, we've certainly learned what not to target, what doesn't work. And that's the scientific method. I mean, I know it's disappointing, it's billions of dollars, it's 2 decades, but that's the way it is for basically all, the cancer example. So we're kind of where cancer was 20 years ago. So that's the first point. We've learned from all these failures. So what have we learned? We've learned that there are different proteins in the brain that have different functions, and these proteins all have a tendency to misfold, to go bad, if you like. They're all folded up like this, and when the parts that are inside stick out, it creates a tremendous toxicity that can propagate slowly through the brain. On average, 17 years, according to Risa Sperling in Washington University, who studied the epidemiology, when this first misfolding of amyloid beta takes place. These are called toxic oligomers. Oligomers are simply small aggregates of 2, 4, 12 strands of amyloid beta that really, they lose energy, they misfold, they become toxic, they kill neurons in the vicinity, and they propagate like prions throughout the brain. So we're focused on our company and others, but ourselves in particular, because of our proprietary technology, are focused on we've developed antibodies that selectively and exclusively can only bind to the toxic forms because of the conformation or shape of these things, not to get into too much of the science. And that's really important, so we can knock out and neutralize the toxic forms that are killing neurons and leave alone some of the normal forms. And so misfolded toxic forms of alpha-synuclein are believed to be a root cause of Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia. Misfolded toxic forms of a protein called TDP-43, the TAR DNA binding protein, are known to be a root cause of ALS and frontotemporal dementia. And in Alzheimer's disease, it's misfolded forms of amyloid beta and also toxic oligomers, hypophosphorylated forms of a protein called tau, TAU, which is also, as we know, the guilty suspect in repetitive head trauma. So addressing those are the root causes as we understand it, as I think the overall literature believes, although there are, it's not 100% concordance, and there may be ancillary drivers as well, never always that exclusive. But once again, I'd like to insist upon the importance of not only addressing the root cause, which is a primary concern, but all the ancillary things that develop as the brain tries to kind of adapt to this miserable situation, if you like, and eventually gets overwhelmed. So let's look more holistically at the kind of compartments of treatment so we can really deliver what these patients and what society needs. And of course, that creates tremendous value not only for patients, caregivers, families, and others, but for shareholders, and that's obviously one of the things we want to do as well.
Excellent. Sina?
Yeah.
Or
Can add more to that. Just to summarize, brain is the most sophisticated biological phenomena on Earth. So many different things happen at many different times, and we have a limited visibility at the moment of what actually happens and what causes. But these are theories, but the most important point, as you mentioned, is that multiple effects, multiple reasons that needs to be attacked simultaneously before brain gets overwhelmed.
Yeah, great. Doug?
Maybe I'll focus on epilepsy, just because it's epilepsy is a disease we do know a fair amount about. It's more of a genetic disorder than a progressive disorder like Alzheimer's. And therapies are not disease modifying, but they control symptoms. So we have a number of powerful drugs in our toolkits that can control epilepsy in kids and adults. The challenge with those products is they need to be taken consistently. If you miss a dose, your risk of a seizure decreases dramatically, and that's where damage occurs. So when we think about drugs like Trokendi, Topiramate being a drug available for decades in North America. Our partner Supernus has now created long-acting versions of it, so it's better for patient compliance and patient control. And I think we're going to continue to have reformulated products in the epilepsy space, better agents for controlling symptoms, and of the many neurological conditions, kind of epilepsy and pain are the two that we're doing our best so far at least controlling symptoms and understanding the root causes of those diseases.
That's terrific. Thank you very much to these excellent CEOs and the virtuous work that they're doing in advancing solutions in different neurodegenerative diseases. Thank you very much.